All right. This episode will be covering something not really discussed a lot in the entrepreneurial world: survival tips for entrepreneurs during a time of grief, strategies on keeping momentum as a CEO leader of your company when suffering loss or even looming loss of ailing parents. I have the amazing Jason Fladlien here. Jason, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, yeah, considering the topic at hand.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I think a lot of us, it's something really not talked about. And I know you have a lot of wisdom to share. And as an entrepreneur myself, like I went through a difficult time, personal and business times in the last couple of years with my dad's ailing health. And then he passed away last year. But you've always helped me when I've been
Mm.
through like severe challenges in my life. And I just thought maybe if you could share your wisdom with others about your experience with loss and how any strategies for entrepreneurs to kind of survive and thrive through this, or maybe rest through it. I'd
Mm.
like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is a topic that's very important to me, and I think it's important in general, but as you said, doesn't get talked a lot. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. It's weird because you kind of have two groups that don't ever exist peacefully together. Like you have these kind of therapeutic geniuses over here, and then you have these entrepreneurs over there, and it's like they're at odds with each other. It's crazy. Like I don't know why, but there's very rarely a bridge that builds that gap together. And I think I've been able to do it. So I can share some of those insights. Before I do that, I want to share some context, right? I'll talk to you about, from a loss perspective, like the two biggest grief events that have ever occurred in my life when it comes to death. Um, the hardest thing that I ever had to experience in my life was when I was 20. I was either 24 or 25. And my brother, Ryan, he passed away and he was 9 years old. It was January 25th, 2009. And he had gotten brain cancer out of nowhere like 6 months prior. And he just turned 9. And he passed, and it was tragic. And it's hard. And it was weird for us because he's my brother, but I was 17 years older than him. So he was kind of like my brother in some ways, but he felt kind of like a son to me in other ways because of that age gap. And it was the hardest thing. And now here we are, it's 2023, right? 14 years later. And I always used to think, Maria, when people would say, you think about him all the time. You think about him every day. I was like, there's no possible way that that's true, right? Well, it is true.
Yeah.
I miss him as much today as I did back then. And that was a very challenging event for me to get through, but I was able to get through it in a way that I think eventually helped me. It's the whole concept of turning what I call adversity into alchemy, right? Like, so that was challenging for me. Before that, I had another experience with death when I was 8 or 9, around that time, and I watched it destroy my mother. So she was taking care of her father, who was at the time the biggest role model to me in my life. My home life was very chaotic, and it continued to be chaotic until I was no longer a child and I was an adult. It's not like the chaos ever quit. I just became an adult and got away from it. And so it was already chaotic, and so my grandpa was kind of like a nice escape from that chaos. Very wise man. But I watched him die a little bit at a time in front of me over a period of like a year or so. And I watched it just destroy my mom because she thought she had to give up her whole life to take care of him as
Yeah.
he got sicker and sicker and sicker. And he had cancer as well. And I grieved, and nobody helped me process that grief when I was a young boy. And my mom grieved too. She grieved in a way that was very destructive: drugs and alcohol, and things like that, right? And my dad dealt with the whole situation by just pretending it didn't exist. Yet it ultimately caused my mom and my dad to divorce, because when my mom came home, my dad says, okay, now we can go back to the way things were, like right after my grandpa died, right? Which is
Yeah.
not an appropriate response, but it so was disastrous. And then on top of all of that, there's a third death now that comes to mind that still hurts more so. These other two deaths that I described, if I've been able to grieve in a way where even though they're sad to think about, there's not like a scar emotionally that's still, it's not a hole in my bucket that if I pour stuff through will filter out, right? A lot of emotional trauma is like a bucket with a hole in it. You pour stuff into it and it doesn't take. So you pour success into it and it just filters out to the bottom, right? You do all this work, these other superficial things to do better, like you eat healthier and you meditate and you deep breathe, but there's still a damn hole in the bucket, right? It still falls through at the end of the day, and you got to do some actual grief work in order to process it. In this last one, I'm still having a little bit of a hole in the bucket, which was a dog that I had named Bryce. And he ended up dying, and that was very traumatic for me, because it happened during a time where my dad had a stroke. And so my dad went from being the strongest person I knew in my life, and this a couple of years ago, all this happened during COVID too, which is like the worst time it could have happened. And then my dad went from being this very strong man, even in his 60s, to now he can't live alone. He's living in an assisted living facility. Sometimes he's not there. He called me the other day because somebody was trying to scam money from him, and you can just tell he's not quite cognitively as functional as he used to be. Yeah. Can't use his left hand, right? Left arm, walks with a cane, and again needs full-time care now, right? And that all happened when my dog passed away, and I worked so hard with that dog because he quit being able to walk, and I was out there working him, helping him walk, and spending so much time. And the dog was really, to me, Bryce was the first time I really experienced love in a way that I felt was truly unconditional, besides the love that my brother and I had. And so like losing that was very hard for me. So these are this is the context in which I can speak to in terms of grief. And this is just related to death. There's other grievous events that have occurred in my life that I don't necessarily have to get into, but this is where the foundation and the basis of how I started to understand how to work through this grief in a way that makes you more of who you are at the end of the day, instead of taking away from you, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of wanted to preface it from that perspective. So with that said, let me tell you what I did at first that didn't work.
Okay, that's good.
And this is what most people do, right? Especially most entrepreneurs do. And that's, I try to fill an emotional hole with successes and achievements and accomplishments, because then maybe I would be good enough, right? Or maybe then I would be worthwhile. Because ultimately the way that I process grief, and there's a whole deep dive you can do in this called maladaptive schemas. It's a fascinating branch of psychology where there's these early maladaptive schemas. A schema is essentially a way in which you process the world and put it into a container. So short answer to that is, you see a 4-legged animal with fur and a tail, and somebody tells you that's a dog, that's a schema. In your mind, a schema is anything with 4 legs and hair and a tail is a dog. And then you find a cat, you tell your family that's a dog, and they laugh at you. No, that's a cat. And you say, oh, okay. So not all animals with 4 legs and a tail and fur are dogs. So you realize this is a schema, that these are dogs, if they have these certain attributions, not an exhaustive list. These are all shortcutted. These are ones that if it's a cat, it's this. And then even within dogs, there's a difference between a German Shepherd, like I had, and a little Chihuahua, et cetera, right? So you all of us do this. We process the world through schemas. And what happens is, early on, if we have these traumatic experiences, especially when our brain's most malleable as a child, we get these what are called maladaptive schemas, where we view the world and something of it's missing, or we draw some sort of conclusion from it that's hard to undo. My conclusion, one of the conclusions that I drew very early on, was I must not be worthy, because if I was, then I would get love and feel safe in this world, and I don't. And a lot of this was stemmed because I fell out of a tree when I was young, about 7 years old, 8 years old, something like that. And I have this scar to this day. Ripped my hand open, blood was squirting out every time my heart beat. It was gnarly and gross and sick, but I was so proud of myself, Maria, because I didn't cry. I went and I showed my dad, and I said, I was so proud of how I was handling it. And my dad started screaming at me instead of like comforting me. And it was because it was a Sunday. And he says, you can't get hurt on a Sunday because we can't afford to take you to the emergency room. And I sat there for like an hour, and that's when I started crying, by the way. That's when the tears came. It was
Oh,
the
wow.
emotional wound, not the physical wound, that really hit and hurt. And I
Yeah.
I waited for an hour or two while him and my mom argued about what they should do with me. Ultimately, they called a friend up who called a doctor up that they knew, who opened up a practice that was 20 minutes away, and they drove me 20 minutes away on a Sunday. And that's how I got taken care of. Just utterly ridiculous. But I had made and then forgotten consciously a decision that day that I was going to get rich. So that way I would never put myself or my family in a position like that ever again, where you'd even have to question about money when it came to a matter like that. Right. But underneath it all, the root became, and it was very insidious and not obvious at first, that I must not be good enough. Because if I was good enough, then I would be taken care of in the way that I need to be taken care of.
Is that sort of, Jason, like also your identity as well?
Yeah. You start
Yeah.
to identify with it,
Yeah.
right? And anything that doesn't conform with that falls outside of that. And so if that's your conclusion, there's nothing that's going to conform with that. Like, because what I thought is, if I just do these things, then I'll get what I need. But you don't. Not external accomplishments will not give you what you need internally.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they might help you in certain ways along the ways to better be equipped to then do the work internally, right?
Yeah.
But working really hard and making lots of money and being super successful, I still felt empty inside. Because I was looking for something to satisfy me emotionally, but what I was doing wasn't related to that. And this is very common amongst entrepreneurs. It's workaholism. It's an addiction.
Yeah.
All addictions are destructive. All addictions lead to ruin over a period of time unless they're dealt with. And workaholism is an addiction just as insidious as a crack addiction is. It's just not as obvious up front, and it's just not as socially unacceptable. And so I became a workaholic. And the beautiful thing about working is, A, you get all the accolades, B, you get all the money, and C, you shut down your ability to feel emotionally because you're too busy to feel, right?
Yeah.
So you push it
been
away.
there.
You don't really shut it down, but you bury it, you push it away, you keep pushing it away, you keep pushing it away. But ultimately, and it makes sense too, because it also keeps you a safe difference from forming true relationships, intimate relationships that are healthy. Because if you're damaged, it's hard to form a relationship with somebody else. You don't even know what that looks like. I didn't, at least, right? With a love, with a significant other, or with children. And so so trying to form intimate relationships is dangerous. And so you don't form them, and you're busy forming these unintimate relationships with tens of thousands of customers all over the world, right? Who sing your praise and love you. And it's really safe because it's hard to harm them. It's hard for them to harm you. And it looks like you are doing a lot of the right things. And in a way you are. I'm not diminishing any of those things, right? I'm just saying I was looking for answers in a store that didn't sell the solution that I needed. And that's what happened. So here's the day where it all changed. The day that it all changed is I'm in Joe Polish's $100,000 a year mastermind. So the good news about money is, once you wake up to the fact that you need help, emotional and spiritual help, you can at least pay for it. You don't have that constraint, which is unfortunate. But a lot of people that need help, they don't have as many options because they don't have as good finances, right? Yeah. And an upcoming 100K meeting was happening, and he says, "Hey, listen, I think this is going to be a cool idea. We have this guest speaker that's going to be coming at the 100K meeting. His name is Dr. Daniel Amen. You live kind of close to him. Why don't you go down there? I'll have him scan your brain, and then we'll show the results to everybody."
To everybody. Oh my.
Dude, I'm cool with that, right? And by the way, I'm like, I had always thought, Maria, that I had put the past behind me, because look at how successful I am. Look at how accomplished I am. Look at all these things that I know and can do. And in all these ways in which I'm useful, right? Really, I was just trying to be useful. So I was hoping somebody would love me, right? But I said, okay, cool. Sounds good. So I go down there to get my brain scan. Now, Dr. Amen has scanned more brains than anybody on planet Earth. Just very controversial figure. Scientifically, they question the value of doing what's like a SPECT brain scan, how the blood flows, and what conclusions you may or may not draw from that. But nonetheless, I go down there and we do a series of tests. He draws some blood, and then he puts me in the scanner and scans my brain. And I'll never forget this. He walks in, and by the way, I came down there initially too, because the way that Joe sold the deal to him is like, Jason will help you with your marketing, because he had like 10 million email list subscribers, right?
Well,
So
that's hilarious.
I'm thinking I'm going to make some money here, get some business done, right? And he walks in the room. And the first thing he's got like a folder with stuff in it, including my brain scan. And he pulls it out and he says, "This is what your brain looks like under the spec scan." And he says, "Notice these 3 areas highlighted." And then he pulls out another set of brain scans. He goes, these are people that have just gotten, this is a person that's just gotten off of war in the battlefield, in the Battle of Afghanistan. And he says, "Notice how they're highlighted in the same 3 places. You have post-traumatic stress disorder." And I'm like, blew my mind instantly, right? And then he says, "You also have ADHD."
Yeah.
And I'm like, I go, "No, I don't have ADHD." And he's like, "Well, the tests show that you do based on your reaction times to this and that." And I go, "Yeah, well, it was because there was a noise humming over here and this light was on over there." And I'm like, "Oh shit, I totally got ADHD," right? And he says, "Here's what I recommend you do. I recommend you start doing EMDR therapy." And so 2 days later, I was sitting in an office with a therapist doing EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, reprogramming, starting to process all these traumatic events. And I'll tell you one thing about that, Maria, that really blew my mind was the intake form for Amen was like, list any traumatic events that have occurred to you. And then at the bottom, it says, if you run out of space, flip it over and continue to writing on the back. And I flipped it over. It was easy. And I continued to write, but I was very logical about it. I was like, yeah, this happened. Like I was reporting like on a spreadsheet, like, because I had learned to distance the emotion from it, dampen it enough so it didn't hurt, and thinking that was successful when it wasn't.
Right.
And so I went and did EMDR, and that was a life changer for me. That's when I realized that I have all of these unprocessed traumas of my past that are continuing to limit me in the present, and limit my growth emotionally, limit my ability to forge healthy relationships with myself and with others. And that's when I started really doing some work. And that's when I learned a lot of the stuff. And that's when I got a long ways to go. But that's when I got a lot better at this. And so that was kind of the game changer for me, right? So every conclusion that I've given you so far, and some of the insights I'm going to provide for the rest of this podcast, come from there.
That is interesting. And, you know, I actually went to Dr. Amen's clinic probably more than a decade ago and had the scan as well. And it is fascinating. And that's the context you've just provided actually tees this up really well for how you're going to help us now.
Yeah. So, and this, I told this to the kids the other day. I said to them, because there's this thing called toxic positivity that's getting really popular these days. Yeah, I guess it's always kind of been there, where it's just like, everything's good, everything's great, everything's fantastic. And my son was kind of getting exposed to this toxic positivity because he was having a hard time with something. And this whole just think positive and just look at this. And we see this all the time in the entrepreneurial world. It borders on delusion. And I said to him, I go, I would rather you feel authentic sadness than inauthentic happiness. And it was a revolution to me, Maria, that it was okay to feel sad, or angry, or mad, or hurt. And I had either been taught or came to the conclusion on my own, or a combination of the two, that like being sad was a weakness. Now, the models in my life, and as a child, you're like a sponge. You model, you more is caught than taught, right? You just pick this stuff up. Is the only ways I've seen sadness demonstrated or anger demonstrated was in unhealthy ways.
That's true. Yeah.
So like an unhealthy way to demonstrate anger is to punch the door and break a hole through it, right? Or an unhealthy way to demonstrate sadness is to lay on the couch crying for hours with a bottle of Jack Daniels. All of events that I've seen, and more, many more, right? And so those are not healthy ways to express sadness, but there are healthy ways to express sadness. And they can be like, what you're doing right now really hurts me. And if you continue to do this, you're either going to have to leave or I'm going to have to leave, because this is not okay. This is not appropriate. I didn't know you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand this concept of boundaries, because there's no real boundaries in how I grew up. That was okay. Like when my therapist first told me that, like, she said to me, she's like, you don't have to let your mom into your kid's life. That's your choice. I was like, you can do that? She's like, yes, if she's not being healthy and supportive of you, you would 100% have the right in order to do that. And I was like, that is incredible. Because in a lot of ways, I was still emotionally a child.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that I had the authority, or there was times, because, like the way that my mom demonstrated anger, and still does to some degree, we can't fix anybody else. We can only fix ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is she just gets this. She's a redhead. So she's got the hell and the fury of a redheaded woman, right? She would scream to the point where it would scare you. And I've seen big men, because, when they were doing a lot of drugs, she would have a lot of unsavory characters of their big guys, some of them who went to prison for murder, right? And gotten out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they would be intimidated by her when she'd get into that mode, right? And so it triggers this fight or flight response. You see somebody get angry with you like that, and you fight it, or in my case, I'd freeze. I would get scared and freeze up to the point I couldn't do anything. And working through, like with a therapist, she'd say, well, what would happen if you said this? And I'd be like, you can say that? I didn't even know that was possible, right?
Yeah.
Learning how to advocate for yourself and learning how to put up appropriate boundaries around what you will and won't tolerate. I didn't know that was a thing. By the way, it makes you very successful in business, right? Because I could break normal boundaries in business that nobody else would even consider violating. A lot of those boundaries are constructs that have no real value to them. Like, we do webinars that are 4, 5, 6 hours long because I go that hard, right? That is a boundary I'm willing to break and come across and go further and deeper and understand my customers better than anybody else. I've learned to dial that in, because that can be unhealthy, right? But that was originally, and still is to this day, a great source of leverage in my entrepreneur business. Is the lack of boundaries in cases where boundaries are not necessarily useful, but in the personal life, having these boundaries. And here's the real challenge for people like me, Maria, is I'm very intellectual, I'm very logical. Often, as you'll see this with people that are traumatized, one of the responses that they go through is they lean a lot on logic at the expense of emotion, because then they think everything through intellectually. And so when I was, sorry, I lost my train of thought here. This is, this stuff brings a lot of memories up simultaneously.
Bringing boundaries, works in business, but in personal life, you started to realize you could have boundaries and say things about your emotions.
Yeah. Damn, it'll come back to me.
Okay.
But essentially, like, I became very intellectual and very logical with everything that I did, and I never was able to emote properly. I got it. Here's what it is. When you get into a state of fight or flight, or in that trauma state, you bypass the intellectual portion of your brain, like the prefrontal cortex. The brain says, all right, you're just shutting down. We're going straight to the brainstem, that reptilian part of you.
Yeah.
The reasoning part of the human brain was the last thing to be developed. Everything else came for it. So that's where logic is useless in the scenarios when adrenaline is pumping through your system, when cortisol is spiking, right? Logic is useless. It's not helpful whatsoever. So we typically we're trying to think our way out of problems that begin in the body. Like, one of the greatest books ever written about this is The Body Keeps the Score. And that's an unbelievably great resource if you want to look in some of the ways. And again, logically, what happens is you disconnect from the body. This is why things like yoga are so valuable, because all of a sudden you start to now be able to hear the warning signs in your body that are saying something's going on here, that right now you're disconnected from, because you've numbed it to the point where you've lost one half of this vital source of communication, the mind-body connection. And this is why people are able to destroy themselves physically and beat themselves up and not change their behaviors, because they're trying to address a problem of the body with the mind. It's the wrong tool for the job, right? That's why EMDR I thought was so effective and so powerful, because this little change in how you process things allowed you to use your brain enough without having the body overwhelm you. But that was some of the issues, is you lean too hard on one, just the logic, and you don't, that's another thing that's safe, that keeps you safe. But here's the hardest thing of all. This is what I really started to learn, Maria, is to do the work without judgment. And I'm still working through that, right? I mean, this is useful in business too. Like, people will sit down to try to create something, and all of a sudden imposter syndrome will kick in. I'm not worthy enough. I'm not good enough. I'm going to be a fraud. Why would anybody want to listen to me? You know, that kind of stuff. So it's useful in business, but it's even more valuable in that personal life. Of like, one of the greatest things I ever heard is, whatever you did, the thinking has led you to be here right now. So like, you look at somebody who's in recovery from an addiction, no matter what deplorable things that they have done or who they've hurt, including themselves, it's led them to the point where they're in a room trying to get better, right? So the same thinking that caused them to be destructive is also what led them there. The same behaviors and action that caused these things to happen also put them in a position to where they could start today to work towards a better tomorrow. And so that was helpful to me, is to accept everything as it is first before trying to change it. And so whatever decision I did was the best I could make under the circumstances. And I truly believe that. You know, if you have some sort of like narcissistic personality disorder, or you're a sociopath or a psychopath, I don't think that is as applicable. But most people aren't those things, right? Most people are doing the best they can with what they have. And when I started to accept and understand that, like, I couldn't have done it any other way. You know, I was a little kid when all this stuff happened to me. How am I supposed to process that? You know, children need somebody to take care of them. Children literally put the lives in the hands of other people because they have no other choice, right? And so if they don't get what they need, how is that ever the fault of the child? It can never be the fault of the child. So a child does what a child can do as best as they possibly can. And so it's that when I started to really understand and lean into that, it made everything a lot easier. I could reserve a lot of the judgment I had for the way that I behaved and how I acted, and the faults that I perceived in myself. And when those got out of the way, all that baggage, it allowed me to be open to grieving, period, right? And then B, go through the process, and do so is hard. So it's already hard enough as it is. It's when you pile these things on, it makes it impossible, right? And so then being able, A, to open up the grieving period, and B, to go through it, and C, then this is really challenging, not try to force it to occur in a certain period of time, right?
Yeah,
like
which
in the
we all
business
try
world,
to
everything should be run under a deadline. Everything needs to be done yesterday. The faster you can be productive, the more money you'll make. It's an economic equation. If I can do twice what you can do in the same amount of time, I will be valuable to you in the marketplace more than twice what you will, right? I will get an exponential result from an incremental improvement in the marketplace. But you can't rush grief for the same way that you can't put, two pregnant women together and make a baby in 4.5 months instead of 9, right? The process is going to take however long the process takes. And that's hard. So, you start judging yourself. And again, at this point in time, it's an automated reflex. It's like, what do we do to depressurize that other than knowing that it's possible and talking about it like we're doing now? Well, you need tools, right? You need different protocols. You need different therapeutic processes. And you need to try a bunch of variety of different things. And then you can start to heal over time. And sometimes it happens fast, and sometimes it takes decades.
Yeah. What tools have you found to be the most effective for you? Because I know for a lot of individuals, I'm glad over the last 3 years, I've done a lot of stuff with feeling my feelings, because my analogy is that, and I've heard this analogy where if you don't, it's like a big beach ball you put underwater, right? And you're keeping stuffing it down. Eventually it's going to blow, right? And, I know statistically there's more for men after a loss. That's why sometimes they have a heart attack so
Mm,
early, because they never allowed themselves to feel and process the grief. Um, Maybe if you could share some tools that you use, which you've
yep.
already have quite a bit, EMDR and the body keeps a score, and a lot of,
Yep.
yeah. But what, for someone listening right now, what tools maybe could you suggest for them?
Yeah. So, and I've the more I do this, the more I realize that there's no one size fits all for anything.
Yeah.
And it seems to be especially true when it comes to dealing with emotional trauma, with grief, and those kind of things, right? So the number one tool for me, it was like I became a monk in my 20s as a Hare
Yeah.
Krishna monk, right? I went full nuclear, right? And
Yeah.
I thought about this recently. I was working on a webinar. I finally put this in there because most of this stuff, Marie, I mean, you knew me for years. You had no idea any of this stuff ever happened to me, right? I never shared
Right.
any of it, right?
Yeah.
That's why I was so good at personal development, because I was trying to get my fix from reading all these personal development books, which I found largely is a fruitless endeavor. It's really good to be productive with them, and they help you in certain ways. But many of them are missing. Many of them are toxically positive to a point of a fault, right?
Mhm.
They're delusional in a lot of different ways, or they have tools that it's kind of like if we put a band-aid over a tumor, it doesn't help, right? The wrong
Mhm.
tool for the job. Um, so I'll share with you a variety of things that I did. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work, some of them worked a little bit, some of them worked a lot. I'm not sure if without one, the other wouldn't have worked, right?
Yeah.
I try as many things as I possibly can. And what doesn't work for me may work for you. And what works well for me may not work at all for you. But I preface this by saying, like, in my 20s, I became a monk. And I put this in a webinar recently. I said, nobody like renounces the material world and becomes a monk because their life is going really good. Almost everybody it's a form of desperation. And so I became a Hare Krishna monk, and it changed my life.
Mhm.
Happiest I've ever been. I was happier from age 20 to 24 than I am now turning age 40, even
Mhm.
though I've sold hundreds of millions of dollars of products, right?
Mhm.
And achieved success beyond most people's wildest imaginations. I am universally considered the greatest webinar presenter of all time, which is insane.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, I quit arguing about it when everybody keeps telling me I am, right? Um, yeah, it's like I was happier then. And because there's that safety of that real true lack of fear of you feel like somebody's taking care of you, God. And there was
Mhm.
tools, the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, and I would chant that an hour to two a day. At that point in time, I was having 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 panic attacks a day. Couldn't leave the house, agoraphobic. And I started chanting and meditating, and I started as a result of eating healthy and cooking, because you cook in a clean way and offer it, and it becomes spiritually sanctified food. And reading like Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and all of these Vedic scriptures, and seeing the insight into the body is temporary, but the soul is eternal, and it's immutable, and it can't be harmed. And you learn these insights, and that was
Mhm.
really wonderful for me. The problem was I learned them too fast, and I treated
Mhm.
it like a typical type A, where I had to be this level of devotee at this point in time. Like I set myself
Mhm.
up for an impossible standard. Story of my life, right? Even when you succeed at those things, you fail. It's fascinating. But so I got burned out from that. I started looking towards business kind of as a way to bridge the gap between the spiritual world and the material world, thinking I would bring it back. I've only started doing that again based on a lot of the different challenges I've had in my life, with some of the stuff that I've went through personally, of which I'm not ready to share yet, but I will one day.
Mhm.
And that to me worked the best and still works the best. And having a community, like I'm going to the temple every Sunday, and that's just is so exquisite, and it's so wonderful, and it's so beautiful. But it took me a while to go full circle back to that. And I'm
Mhm.
now I'm smart, and I'm tempered, and I'm measured, and I'm not trying to change the world overnight or become a perfect devotee overnight, right? But some of
Mhm.
the things in between there. The good news is I had a foundation, so I could
Mhm.
meditate for hours and learn how to quiet the mind. So I knew it was possible because I had done it before. If I didn't have the Hare Krishna training, which I had before my brother passed away, I don't know how I would have survived. I
Mhm.
really don't. It was my
Interesting.
ability to lean on my faith that allowed me to make it through. Although when I gave his eulogy, And the way that I was able to parse through that was I said, he had this spirit. It was so beautiful. And just such an amazing thing. And I said, if we can capture that spirit and show up with some of that spirit ourselves, and it's like he truly never left us and that he's still present in our lives. Right. And I thought that helped me out a lot, that if I could do great things in his name and show up with the spirit of fun and creativity that he had, he never was afraid of death. 8-year-old boy, what kind of wisdom is in there? I don't know. Yeah. And so that helped me through that, combined with the spiritual understanding that I had at the time of realizing that this is just a temporary body and the soul beneath of it is still out there. And, I won't get too into the depths of that because I could go on for hours just related to scripturals and all this kind of stuff. Nonetheless, though, right? So I had that as a foundation, and that's really helpful. EMDR was a game changer for me, and that was super valuable. Doing yoga, for whatever reason, hot yoga worked out really well for me for a period of time. What happens in a lot of these issues, and you got to be careful with this, Maria, is you'll see like in the weightlifting world, they call these newbie gains, right? Somebody who's never lifted weights, they start lifting weights, they grow really fast. And then the growth after that goes really, really slow, right? So like these emotional therapeutic processes, you get these newbie gains where you get a surge of a massive amount of uptick, and then it whittles down after a while, and then you get frustrated. So like you learn to adapt, and you can't get too caught up in any dogmatic approach. Otherwise it's going to lead to disappointment. And so the hot yoga helped me out a lot. It got me connected with my body again, which then was a precursor for me to getting connected with my spirit again. And that was useful. Deep breathing exercises, like all sorts of different breath work I now know how to do. And I still do a lot of it. Like Wim Hof breathing was to me the easiest breathing to get the biggest benefit in the least amount of time. And that was super useful. Journaling was helpful, but I didn't get as much out of it as most other people do. So I'm an on again, off again journaler. Every so often I'll journal. And I'm looking at my journal over there. It's got like just full pages of pure emoting of the good and the bad. You bleed on these pages, right? And there's something therapeutic about that. But it was a hard process for me, so I couldn't stick with it. I started doing another form of journaling, which was useful, where it's like did, saw, heard, draw. So you divide one piece of paper into 4 quadrants. Here's what I did yesterday. Here's what I saw yesterday. Here's what I heard, and then draw a picture of the day. And I've been doing that again, very inconsistently, but somewhat. Eating very clean and healthy, cutting out processed foods for the most part, eliminating them as much as I possibly can. Was very helpful to me, but it hits a point of diminishing returns. It helps in some ways, but it doesn't solve everything. Exercise is critically important. It could just be a 20-minute walk a day. It doesn't have to be anything insane. But some sort of regular form of exercise, some sort of meditation. So I tried all sorts of meditation, and I landed right back where I started. I was like, chanting Hare Krishna was a better form of meditation to me than every other form of meditation I tried. And I tried every single other form of meditation that I could ever possibly think about, right? Open focused, as opposed to narrow focus training, learning how to train yourself to see things with an open focus. There's a book I'm reading on the topic right now. It's what is it? It's right on my phone. I'll pull it up and look at it right now and tell you. The Open Focus Brain, right? By Jim Robbins and Les Femi. And this is and I knew about it before, but I've been back into it again, where we focus so narrowly as a modern society too much, and that creates so much anxiety and so many problems. And learning how to do an open focus where you don't see just the foreground of a picture, you see the full picture. So learning how to defocus, that turns the mind off, and that helps a lot. And that's been very useful to me. Having a therapist that I talk to on a regular basis. I just did a therapy session yesterday. I do one a week. And that's challenging because you have to have a good therapist. And that's hard to do. A, they have to be objectively good. B, they have to subjectively be good in the ways that can help you, right? I have a friend that has OCD. If they do traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, it will make their OCD worse. What they have to do is have an OCD specialist that knows how to do specific therapy for OCD. It's a modification of cognitive behavioral therapy, to where like you take somebody that doesn't have OCD and has a fear of something, generally encouraging them to get over that fear by trying stuff out, is a good thing. So it's like with dog training, which I'm an amateur at, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating subject to me. Like if a dog's afraid of getting their nails clipped, what you first do is you just show the nail clipper, and then you give them a treat. And then they associate good things with seeing the nail clipper. And then pretty soon you just touch a part of their body with the nail clipper, and then you give them a treat, right? And now they associate the closeness of it, right? And then pretty soon you don't even clip their nails yet. You just put it next to their paw and you give them a treat. And then eventually you clip a single nail and then you give them a treat, right? It's a gradual process to take a very scary stimulus, you break it down and you grow it over time. That's good in a lot of instances. You do that with somebody with OCD, you'll make them crazier. The best thing you can do with somebody with OCD is, like with an OCD person, one of the things that they can have OCD around is making sure every door was locked before they leave the house. And some of them can't leave the house because you never truly know if you've ever locked the door or not. Maria, can you know with 100% certainty? No, you can't. So they'll leave the house and then they'll come back and check and lock the doors. And pretty soon they develop rituals where I got to check it 5 times before I can feel comfortable, right? So the obsession is the door locked. The compulsion is I checked it 5 times, therefore it's good. If you go to somebody and you say, well, let's stop and let's start checking it only 4 times, right? Or let's check it in the morning instead of the evening, you're just going to create more uncertainty for them. What you do with somebody with an OCD personality in that instance is you say, and then what? So you didn't lock the doors, and then what? And then somebody breaks into my house, and then what? And then they burn it down, and then what? Right? You run it through with them. You actually, if you're a good therapist, you create scripts with them. Like the person that I know is they're afraid they're going to be sick all the time because you never really know if you're going to be sick or not, right? And so they have a script that I will be sick in the future. Then they read that script and then they learn to deal with the uncertainty. And then what? Like the classic example I was taught is if somebody had OCD where they were afraid they were going to lose control and kill their family. Like this is hardcore stuff, right? So you kill your family, then what? Then they send me to a mental asylum, and then what? And then I have to live the rest of my life in a mental asylum. Okay. So you still have to live the rest of your life. You still have to pick up and move on. And then they get past that uncertainty over time. It's hardcore stuff. It's really hard to do, right? So you need a therapist who understands that. Most of them don't. I've seen it firsthand helping this friend. It's like they just don't get it. And then finding a therapist that gets it, then they got to be good at it. And then they got to be the right person for you personality wise. So therapy is so damn hard because it's hard to even, when you're in a state of compromise, it's hard to even tie your shoes and brush your teeth, much less go out through the arduous process, especially through insurance, to find somebody, right? Yeah. And then you got to hope that you get lucky. You probably won't. Like you got to then find 10 of them in freaking therapist shop and try them out. And how long should you try them all out for? Like, I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
This is why you got to have so much empathy in the process. And so having the right therapist, there's a good chance that the first few therapists you'll pick will not help you. They'll probably make it worse. You got to advocate for yourself. And that's challenging and that's frustrating. But the right therapist, if you find them, is unbelievably useful and helpful to you. Yeah. For no other reason than sometimes you just knowing you have somebody in your corner. Yeah. Is everything. You know, getting a German Shepherd was such a therapeutic thing for me. And that happened purely by accident. Later on, I didn't know I had PTSD. Later on, you learn, having a dog, like especially breeds like a Shepherd, they help tremendously with people with PTSD. They help more with people with PTSD than a majority of the therapeutic protocols that have been designed to deal with PTSD. Just having a dog or a horse, right? The equine therapy is more effective. The body keeps the score, does a really good job of breaking these things down. What I discovered was before I read the book, I was doing a lot of those things because they talk about yoga. I was doing yoga. They talk about like equine therapy or animal therapy, and I got a dog, and I hated dogs before I got one, Maria. And this is how an early maladaptive schema can inform the rest of your life, right? I was a cat person because cats don't care. They just don't. They don't get attached. A dog will put themselves in a compromised position. They'll roll over, expose their belly, and say, "Love me or kill me. I don't care." They're faithful to a fault in my mind. So I'm like, man, dogs are stupid. Cats are where it's at. And then I got this one dog, and just melted my heart. And then that was why it was so hard to lose him, right? And so working through that with a therapist to help me out, using resources given to me, by Dr. Amen, was useful to me, and reading as many books on the subject as I possibly can, even to this day. Like, it's funny because like I literally have the OCD book sitting right here in front of me, and I look through it from time to time, right? There it is right there. And I have two journals. I have my journal over there, and I have my journal over there. And I have breath walk. It's a form of breathing while you're walking. And I have that book right there, right? Like, I have just as many books on dealing with this as I do on business on my desk right now. And so here's the advantage I have though, Maria, that most people don't have. All of this makes me a better entrepreneur. So the closes that I use now on the webinars have come from this deeper understanding of emotional trauma and grief. And I've been able to use it. Like, I used to be like most other people are to this day. And I run into them all the time. And I run circles around them in a sales process and in a fulfillment process. Somebody, I was working with a client. This is a perfect example. So they were doing the webinar, and then I come on and help them with the close. And then so we're closing back and forth. And this is a close I used to use. People still use it. And he believes this and he lives it. So it makes sense for him to use it, although it's not very useful. And he says, somebody asked about how much time it would take. And he's like, sometimes you just got to get up a little earlier and stay up a little bit later. And sometimes you got to substitute your favorite television show for this instead. How bad do you want it? Right. Not a bad close. And like I said, I've used it for years, and it'll appeal to a certain segment, generally a masculine segment, a male segment. Right. And it will appeal to them, even limited from that perspective. And it's not bad advice. And I'm not saying we bubble wrap everybody, because that's the other problem. Some people have went too far the other way with it, right? Where they're trying to make everything safe. When you do that, then even normal stuff becomes dangerous, right? You can't do it that way either. There's always a calibration between both extremes are wrong. That's a good general rule of advice, right? Both extremes are always wrong. So if you're hardcore right leaning or you're hardcore left leaning, you're both wrong. Hate to break it to you. Any extreme position is ultimately going to end up being wrong, because the world is not binary. The world's on a spectrum, and everything's on a spectrum. And so the close that I use, and I use this all the time, and I use this in here, and this is a deep empathy and understanding of my audience, because I've studied them. It's like, I'm not the only thing on their plate, right? So I'll give you an example of a customer of ours who told me in a webinar once, she had gotten out of an abusive relationship with her husband. And he beat her just mercilessly, just terribly beat her. Right. And she finally got under his thumb, and she's been 9 months on her own, and she's been scared to even do anything in life, much less start a business. Right. If you tell her to suck it up and you tell her just to work harder at it, you've lost her. But she only confided that into me in a chat on a webinar, because she trusted me enough to be vulnerable with me and allow me to understand more of her world than anybody else that she was willing to at that point in time. Because I had exhibited empathy. And I think about people like her and other people. Like, I think about another client who came to me once, or another customer on a webinar, and was like, I just put my dad in an assisted living facility because he has dementia, and there's days he doesn't even recognize me. And I try to think of those people when I sell. So if you tell that person, you just need to suck it up, you just need to work harder, you just need to carve out more time, right? You are missing that person. You're not helping them. Instead, and the time close that I understand, that I use now, is I say, yeah, we're all busy, and we all have a lot of different things coming from a variety of different angles at us, and we're being pulled from all different angles. And I don't want this to be the thing that takes up everything else. I want this to make your life easier, not harder, right? So I understand and appreciate when you ask me, how much time is this going to take? And then I'll transition it, right? I'll transition it to something. And I don't never do it as good now as I would do it if we were in the zone and I was in flow, right? And there was real money on the line. So this won't be as good as I normally would do it, but it's good enough. And I'll generally do something along the lines of this. I'll say it's less the time you put in, it's more the consistency in which you apply the time. So if you can only give me 10 minutes a day, but you can do that in focus and you can do that over a long period of time, then I'll take you. But if you can do 10 hours here, 5 hours there, 7 hours there in these sprints, I don't want you, because that's not how you're going to be successful. Now, it's true, the more time you put into it, the sooner you can get the result. But this is not a race. It's a journey. It's a way for us to grow. And anytime you invest time to better yourself, I think that's time well spent. Wouldn't you agree with that? And so you take a much softer hand approach, as opposed to you just got to work harder. You just got to work harder as a character assessment. What I'm doing is both a character assessment and a situational consideration. And I'm bringing that in because I can have empathy now with the end user. I don't believe a majority of people that we come across are lazy. I think they already have a full day. I don't think they sat around twiddling their fingers saying, I have 2 free hours just sitting idly by waiting for something to fill it up. And I'm going to keep it on hold until the right thing comes along. That's nobody. All of us have already crammed 30 hours into a 24-hour day. So if I'm unempathetic to that, I will miss that person and they will not resonate with me and I will not be able to help them. And that doesn't serve them and that doesn't serve me. So I wasn't able to really tap into that until I did this work. So to me, there's an extra layer of value to it. Not only does this help me personally, it also helps me professionally. And so if that to me is an edge, if you can find an edge to do this work, not only to help you in this way, but to help you in other ways that are not directly related to it, I think that can get you to do some of this work. For men, it's harder than women, I think, Maria, because our brains are structurally different. That's a proven fact. And we have an area of our brain which is smaller when it comes to dealing with emotion than women do. We are more designed to do things, and this is on a spectrum. It's not a black or white. We are generally more on the side of the continuum that says we like results driven type of things, procedural type of things. 1, 2, 3, let's get the job done. Women generally fall more on the other end of let's build relationships and let's make sure everybody feels connected and safe, right? If you can holistically bring in both by having that both represented on your team, or just in general, realize that one isn't better than the other and one on itself is limited if you don't also bring the other one in. I think then that's extremely useful when it comes to not only integrating all of the things that can help you grow as a person and heal from your traumas and your grief, but also it makes you more likely to connect with other people. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's hard to feel safe without some sort of connection. And so seeking connection now is some sort of connection that can make you feel safe is tantamount. It is key, but it's hard because oftentimes the grief you have is because of a connection that went wrong or a connection you had once but lost, right? But that with, even though it's hard, is it worth doing it? The alternative is harder, right? And then that's kind of some of the things that I can speak on this, Maria. It's interesting for me to talk about this stuff because this isn't something I've talked about 1,050 times, right?
Right.
So I don't know how to bait the hook. I don't know how to set the foundation. I don't know how to open the loops and then close them in reverse order. I don't have the cool talking points and the bumper sticker style punchlines on this kind of stuff, right? But hopefully what I said today was useful in some way, shape, or form to somebody. If only one person hears this and it helps them start to do a healing process that currently is stunted, then I'll consider this a massive success.
No, I truly appreciate it. I think this was a ton of value, and I don't think it needs to have that whole framework to it because there is no framework for grief. Like you said, everyone has a different thing that might work for them where it's no cookie box cutter. So I loved, to close this off, Jason. First, let everyone know how they could reach you. And I just want to also say, one of the words at the beginning, you said turning adversity to alchemy. I love that. So I just, maybe that's what the name of this podcast episode will be, Adversity to Alchemy with Jason Fladlien. But I want to thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your pearls of wisdom that you've shared.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on. It was great to talk about a subject that's really important to me that I don't really get a chance to discuss, right?
Yeah. So it's jasonfladlien.com. Is that the best way for people to find out more about you, or?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right. Thanks, Jason.
Oh, you're welcome.